This is Hadrian Radio, coming to you from Free Catalonia, a KA radio production.
Hello, good afternoon and welcome to Radio Hadrian again. This is another extra program that we decided to do after the events of the 17th of August here in Barcelona. Although we did a tribute program last week, a tribute to the deceased, the injured, the families, the friends, the emergency workers, the police, the ordinary members of the police who have to be at the coalface of these type of incidents, and all the witnesses, of which there were very many. The fallout from that event naturally continues, and the media are going to get themselves a bit tangled up because we're going to be going into the period of the pre-referendum, the run-up to the referendum, which happens here on the 1st of October. So the media are still milking Thursday the 17th's events for all it's worth, as you would expect them to do. And of course, the number of conflicting reports on every aspect of it vary completely, from videos of shootings, from reports of the Imam in Ripoll, who was here, who was there, who got killed, who didn't get killed, and a lot of things that don't make sense. We know it was a false flag, as most of these so-called attacks are. Well, no, I shouldn't say so-called attacks because they are very much attacks. I'm not going to use the word ISIS or terrorist, because the real terrorists, as we know, are the governments associated with NATO. Let's say we take the white van in Las Ramblas. A young Islamic looking, actually you can't say Islamic looking because Islam has many faces. Some Islamic people are as white as I am, and some Islamic people have red hair. Let's say the young Middle Eastern looking man, whose photograph spread almost virally within hours of the event. Let's say this young man was Islamic. He is as much a victim as the dead people, the injured, the witnesses, all of these other people. Now, I know that my view isn't a particularly popular view. It's not a view that I've formed in the last 2 weeks. It's a view which I've held for, I could go back 2011, 2010, when I first began working with Islamic youth in the southeast suburbs of Melbourne. So I'm returning to this subject of youth, radicalized, disenfranchised youth in war and politics. So rather than dwell on the events of last week, because although I live in Barcelona, I am quite immersed in the local culture. I am not an outside observer when it comes to things here. I do not have the depth of knowledge that gives me the right to talk about local politics concerning this event. What I will say is, and I know this is repeating last week, but I'll go on to the rest of it in a moment. The false flag attack that took place on the 17th of August was related to the referendum that is coming up, because Spain, like London, and like other colonial masters, will do anything to stop these smaller countries gaining independence. When I go back to the idea of Islamic youth, it strikes me that every time the media, every time I look at a TV screen, I open up my computer on MSN or Yahoo, I open a newspaper, there are photographs of these Islamic men. Now, the official story, of course, shows these photographs and states that these are the people who did the filthy deeds, but that's the official story, and we don't buy that, because there are things about this that don't add up. For example, why is it always young Islamic men? And they're always between a certain age. Approximately from 15 to 25 is getting old. They are not mature people. They're not 40-year-olds or 50-year-olds. The people working behind them certainly will be much older, but these are always very young. Some of them are boys. Some of them are teenagers. Many of you listening will have children. How many of you with a 15-year-old know what 15-year-old boys can be like? 15-year-old girls as well, but these are always boys in these instances. Although, yes, there was a female involved in this, but overwhelmingly 99% of the time we are talking about young male youths. So the media very, very quickly put out, or the police and the media together put out photographs of young Islamic men. If we accept the official story, we accept that these were the perpetrators of these atrocious acts. And as always, they have their perfectly intact identity. Then we have the Islamic phobia, the anti-Islamic mood that stems from this, that's been growing and being perpetuated by Western governments, by NATO governments, which of course is why we always get these photographs so quickly. It occurred to me that, isn't it amazing how fast the police find the culprits of all of these events, have their photographs, and can identify them so quickly? And yet, the police in Spain, the UK, Australia, the United States, France will have how many cold cases sitting on their books? Cases that they gave up on, or they gave up on, or couldn't solve, or didn't want to solve, and yet in these cases they can solve them so quickly. Coincidence? I don't think so. If I step back from the actual incidences of last Thursday the 17th, so the focus of what I'm going to talk about now for the rest of this program is why we need to look past these photographs that we get bombarded with. And of course, in this day and age, we are bombarded with news. We have 24-hour news programs. We have the internet, which bombards us with news. So these photographs are flashed in front of our eyes, and not just flashed, they're sitting on screens for long periods of time, so that we recognize these faces so quickly, and we're bombarded with it. If we only saw those photographs in a newspaper in the morning, and you might see that same photograph for a few days in a newspaper, in the days when people read newspapers rather than got their news online, you wouldn't memorize that photograph as much as we do now. I bet nearly every person listening to this, if anybody's listening to it, will be able to picture at least one of those young Islamic men whose photograph has been in our face for over a week now. But we need to look past those photographs, and instead of adopting anti-Islamic ideas and movements, which I don't, and I never have, never will, and I know that many people also don't have anti-Islamic feelings because of this. In fact, I think the Islamic world has probably got more support from the West, or from ordinary people in the West, because of these things and because of the way Islam is demonized. But that's exactly the point. NATO governments need to demonize somebody. It's more than being a scapegoat. They need to have somebody who is brainwashed enough to do their dirty work and create a false enemy, to create an enemy from the countries which they are trying to dominate. And so let's think about youth and war. This is not a new idea. Youth has always been a part of war. And for those Scots listening, think about the young soldiers that went off to fight, especially in the First World War. 15, 16-year-olds lying about their age to get in, and 18, 19-year-olds been sent off to fight a war. How many of them died? How many of them were used by the UK government? Where do those young men come from? Where did those young men come from? From the poorer areas of the country, less educated, and nothing has changed. Let's think about the different wars that we know for a fact that youth have been used either for a future purpose or as a scapegoat. The Second World War, the Nazi youth movement. 7 million youths were in that movement by its end. 7 million over a period of years that the Second World War lasted for. That is brainwashing youth at its best. That was done to ensure that the Nazi movement and Hitler's philosophies would last into the future, to create a future generation. And as we know, those youngsters were totally brainwashed in school, in the community, to the point where so many times they would report their own parents, their own family to the authorities, and that often resulted in their parents being jailed or murdered. Now, if you can persuade young people to spy on their families, report on their families, and allow their families to be jailed or murdered, then you can do anything with young people. Communist China did the same thing. They targeted rural youth and poor families, and it re-educated them. It brainwashed them so that they would become good citizens of the communist regime and that they wouldn't question things. So Communist China had what they called the Youth League, the Communist Youth League. And that league is still going. It's 91 years old, I think. That provided, up until very recently, a training ground for many marginalized officials in the communist regime and in present-day China. It's lost its impetus because it is now being questioned as China has become much more of a capitalist society. And this is a really good thing because there was a particular incident, this is a horrible incident, of a 2-year-old girl, only last October, a 2-year-old girl in a rural Guangdong village was run over by a vehicle. Nobody came to this little girl's rescue. They stood and watched. A big crowd of people, including 18 members of the Youth League, stood and watched as this 2-year-old lay seriously injured on the road and was run over by another vehicle. Nobody helped her. And an official who watched this then later questioned it and said, "We've gone too far with the Youth League. In this day and age, this is not under Mao Zedong anymore, this is a very different era. And if we are going to brainwash young people or train young people, whichever word you want to use, so that they only see life through the party eyes. They see the party as the be-all and end-all of everything, at the cost of public compassion and civic spiritedness." He was later horrified. Of course, he's a product of that as well. So the Communist Youth League in China has been scaled back. They're actually reducing it, and it's probably, I don't know, maybe eventually going to disappear, but it's been going for 91 years. And its heyday was under Chairman Mao and his wife, who used and abused youth horrendously to their own end purposes for the communist regime. Then we have the Spanish Civil War. I only learned about this recently. The Spanish Civil War used and abused thousands of orphaned youth, orphaned children. So children and youth, so anything up to 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. It gave them a home. They were orphaned because of the war. They were given homes by the Spanish government. They were trained to be soldiers, and they were put back into the war to kill people. And because they were orphans, they were highly vulnerable. In a war, being an orphan, I think your only chances of surviving would be either if you are taken into care by the warring government, in this case with child soldiers, or you become very, very, very street savvy and you fight for yourself. Either way, you end up doing things that children shouldn't be doing. So the Spanish Civil War actually was very active in using children to suit its own end means, after, of course, killing their parents in the first place and making these children orphans. Young people and children are always the last to be considered in war. Then I come to Africa, where over recent years there have been horrendous wars. Rwanda, South Sudan, Liberia, the Horn of Africa. Terrible wars that have resulted in mass numbers of refugees leaving Africa and settling in other countries. Those wars are infamous for child soldiers, for you having child soldiers, all of them. And through my work in Australia, I was fortunate enough to meet and get to know some of these amazing young people who had been child soldiers. Two of them in particular turned, I don't know how they did this, they turned their horrific experiences of being kidnapped and forced to become child soldiers into a positive by telling that story through music. They became rappers and they started singing their story. There were two boys. I'm going to actually put one of their songs up on the Facebook page for Radio Hadrian. Through their story, they were able to heal themselves. They were lucky because not all youngsters who become child soldiers can do that. They had an incredibly positive attitude to life, but their stories were horrific. Their stories were unbelievable. They didn't ask to become child soldiers. They didn't ask to be kidnapped, to be forced to drink beer, to be put in charge of machine guns, and to spend every single day and night with adult soldiers, and to witness unbelievable atrocities. Atrocities that nobody should have to witness. And I'm going to tell you one of the things, because this is an example of the type of thing that happens when we recruit children into war, young people into war. In Rwanda, one of my young friends, who now is happily at university in Australia studying music, which is absolutely fantastic, he had to witness people eating each other. He was 10 years old. I'll move on to Islamic youth and how we're using them. I'm not using them, but our governments are using them. This so-called war on terror, which Western governments have created, this name, the war on terror, I'm not quite sure who first coined it, probably George Bush, Margaret Thatcher possibly. I don't want to go back and think about which prime minister, which president dealt with which is which, but let's say certainly the phrase the war on terror has been coined by Western governments and in turn has demonized the Islamic community. First of all, we demonized the Jews. Then we demonized the communists. Now we're demonizing Islamic people or Islamic nations, Islamic culture. We have been engaged, our governments, the United States, the UK, NATO, and Australia, which is not in NATO, but it's very much involved in this. The Australian government is no innocent bystander in all of this. Have created wars in countries to protect drugs and to protect oil and to protect their filthy capitalist greed. They have to have a demonized people, they have to have scapegoats, and they have to work very hard and cover all aspects of their plan. And this plan has been going for years. It's been going since before 9/11. Possibly it goes back to before Lockerbie. The Scots listening to this will know what Lockerbie was about. That was the direct result of an oil deal with Libya. ISIS is a concoction of NATO governments. So having done that wee rundown of wars within the last 100 years which have used youth and abused youth, turned them into killers, now leads me to talk about what is so different about the young Islamic men, who mostly men again, but the young Islamic people who are also victims of this. When you think about the countries who have been warring, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and all of the others, we've created a mass movement of people which naturally are the refugees. And if you get the chance to escape from that environment, whether it be from the actual country itself, which is at war, or whether it be through a United Nations camp. So for people in Afghanistan, let's say, their camps were in Pakistan. They would escape from Afghanistan and get to the United Nations camps. From there, they would be picked and sent to, let's say, Canada or Australia, the United Kingdom. They did not choose to go to these places. But if you've come out of a war, and I keep quoting Afghanistan because I was directly involved with a lot of Afghan youth in Australia. If you come from one of those countries, you've already been through unbelievable trauma because of the war. You then spend life in a camp. It's supposed to be a camp to protect you, but life in these camps is often as bad as the war. You don't exchange the trauma of the war for a cozy little comfortable time in a camp. The camps are very dangerous places. They are tough, and they are the type of places that people want to get out of. It's a stepping stone. It's a violent and dangerous stepping stone to freedom, to try and rebuild your life after being in a war-torn country like Afghanistan. So let's say UNHCR, that's the United Nations humanitarian program, which decides which refugees should go to which country. It's not a case of queuing up in the camps in Pakistan and saying, let me think, which country would I like to go to? I'd like to go to Australia. Or, I'd like to go to the UK. Most of these people come from rural places. They're often illiterate in their own language, and they really haven't a clue about countries around the world. Their schooling, if they had any schooling, was possibly, because they come from rural backgrounds, limited to mostly males, and stopping at an early age if it wasn't disrupted by the war anyway. So sometimes they've never been to school, or their schooling has been so disrupted that it's not worth even talking about. You can't pick a whole family from one of the camps and say, right, this whole family are going to be relocated in Glasgow. It doesn't work like that. Very few people get this opportunity. So what happens is that the youngest and the healthiest male will be sent ahead because it is deemed that he will have the best chance of getting work and will be able to send money back to his family so that they can survive, they can keep going, but they always live in the hope of bringing the family to join them. These youngsters, young men, end up living together. So I'm talking about Australia at the moment because I know that personally. I know how that works very well. They end up in houses which only have young men living in them. So let's say you have a suburban house and you might have 5, 6, 7, 8 young men only living in it because the women haven't arrived. The women, their family are still back in their other country. So they have no role models within the house. They don't have a mother or a grandmother or a sister to keep them on track. They don't have a father with wisdom or a grandmother with wisdom. And they're young. They're severely traumatized. They are very vulnerable. They spend a lot of time online overnight because that's how they can engage with their families. And the whole point is that they want to bring their families out to them. They want their families to come and join them. And sometimes it never happens. But they live in hope. They go to school and they also have part-time jobs. And the part-time jobs are always jobs that exploit these youngsters. They pay atrocious, almost always, not always, I beg your pardon, not always, but almost always, jobs which exploit these youngsters. Horrible conditions, terrible pay, and, well, if you don't want it, somebody else will come along and have it. So you either do it or you don't. And as every single wave of migrants, so if I go back and I can call them migrants for a moment, even though they are refugees, this is what migrants have been doing all the time. The young, healthy male goes ahead, works, sends money home, and establishes a life in the new country, and then tries to bring the family out. The Greeks have done it, the Scots, the Irish, the Italians. This is no different. I guess the only difference is that these young men have ended up there as the result of war. Wars that we've created. So we've created the war, then we create the refugees, then we create ISIS. So what's the connection between ISIS and radicalized Islamic youth? The connection is that NATO governments, having created this atrocious situation, know that there's going to be some very vulnerable youth amongst these people. Very vulnerable. There's also some very strong-minded youth, but think of it like this. You think of a drug dealer or a drug addict. So somebody whose whole life depends on getting their fix. Everything in their life depends on this, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody listening who may have any involvement or family involvement in the terrible world of drug addiction and what drug dealers do. They have got a victim. They've got somebody who is so hooked on that product that they will do anything to get that fix. And drug dealers will follow drug addicts. They'll hang around near their home. They'll hang around near their work. If they know that that young, not necessarily young, but that drug addict is trying to break that cycle, which is a pretty damned hard thing to do, they'll make it as hard as possible for that person to break this habit. They'll follow them. They'll harass them, and they'll make sure that they always come back to it, the drugs, because drug addicts are vulnerable people. And the drug dealers are part of a chain, just like with Islamic youth, vulnerable Islamic youth, they are part of a chain of people. And the chain stops, just like in drug trafficking, with our governments. With the UK, and when I say UK, I talk about all component parts of the UK government. Scottish, Westminster, the Welsh and the Irish. They're all part of it. The US, Australia, and all the other NATO countries. They are all guilty, but they don't do the dirty work, do they? They have other people to do the dirty work. And that's why they can target 15-year-old Islamic boys, they are only boys, to do their dirty work for them. So, of course, when you target a 15-year-old, you don't target him and send him out in a white van to go and mow down people in a tourist place. You have to manipulate him. You've got to feed him the propaganda. You've got to make him dependent on you. You have to create a situation where he will do anything for you. And that's exactly what happens. So by the time these young people are carrying out these atrocious acts, yes, they are responsible for killing people. And yes, that is very, very wrong. But they have been manipulated to the point where they will do anything for their so-called family. The family being the atrocious monsters who organize all of this. We have schools, for example. Some years ago, one of the jobs I had in Australia was working for an NGO which had many, many different programs, and most of them involved Islamic families from war-torn countries, so refugees at some point in their journey of resettlement. My job involved working directly with schools, secondary schools, mostly secondary schools. And through that, I came to meet many Islamic youth workers. And what I discovered was that whilst the people I worked with, and I worked with some amazing people, if any of them happen to listen to this, either here in the broadcast, which I doubt it because it's the middle of the night in Australia, or through our YouTube podcasts, I have nothing but respect for the people from all the different countries that I worked with and what they were doing to make life better for these people. What happened one year was that school principals, there had been a small incident involving the usual Islamic youth. Now, whether the Islamic youth in question was an actual terrorist or whether he was one of these recruited terrorists, courtesy of our Western governments, it's not known. But the result of this was that every single school principal in Melbourne, not just Melbourne, no, in the whole of Victoria, the state of Victoria, was sent an urgent memo during the long summer holidays. This memo told, so this is the Department of Education and Training in Melbourne, which covers the whole state of Victoria, directed every school principal, so that's headmasters, to instruct their teachers, their teaching staff, to be on the lookout for radicalized and disenfranchised youth. They don't need to say the word Islam because it's taken for granted. That's what they're saying. They're not allowed to say Islam, actually, but everybody knew that's what it meant. The school principals that I worked with were horrified. They were horrified because they had some amazing youngsters that had come out of these wars and into this situation. Some of these amazing people. And they were going to become targets. They were going to be watched. And this of course, created fear amongst the schools. The idea was you would create fear, teachers would become hyper-vigilant, and of course, then there would be other students that would be on the lookout, and you can picture the horrendous situation. So, what's the answer? Well, apart from the ridiculous notion that our governments should stop bombing the hell out of Islamic countries, and I'm talking about Islamic countries in the Middle East, I'm not talking about Islamic countries over in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia. Remember, Indonesia has the biggest Islamic population in the world. But we don't bomb them because our Western governments work closely with them. They are friends of the Indonesian government. So that's not going to happen. But I have one idea, and it's probably not a very popular idea, but sometimes in the aftermath of these events, there will be suggestions. I think this has happened in the UK that we should remove the mosques, they should stop the women wearing hijabs and burqas, and we should all become hyper-vigilant, but we remove everything that represents Islam. And I totally disagree with that. That's wrong. I believe and I know there's a lot of psychological evidence to back this up, is that instead of demonizing Islam even further, because that's what removing these things would do, we embrace it and we use the mosques, the imams. I'm not talking about the particular imam here, who of course had a history of drug trafficking and had been in jail, but most of the imams I know are really good people, and they care about this too. They don't want this to happen. The Islamic community don't want this to happen. That we engage them, and the solutions have to come from within the Islamic community, not from non-Islamic people telling them what to do. That's like white Australians telling Aboriginal people what to do, and that's not on. So we need to embrace them, and they need to come up with the solutions, but they must work hand in hand and in partnership with non-Muslims. It should be run by Muslims for Muslims, with support of other groups, other agencies, other people. The interventions need to take place. Interventions, social interventions, educational interventions, psychological interventions, particularly for young people who come from Islamic countries, war-torn countries, into our communities. They need massive support. They need massive intervention because they are all traumatized, and they need our support. That's how we prevent radicalization and disenfranchisement of Islamic youth. Not by demonizing them and not locking them, but putting them away and restricting their opportunities and saying, no, you can't do this when you come to a new country. You can't do that. You must do this. You must do that. That's not much better than the camps that they have come out of, the detention centres. So that's all I'm going to say at the moment. I know there will be a lot of people who don't like what I've said, who don't agree with what I've said. But remember, I don't say this to absolve for example, the driver of that white van. If indeed he was a young Islamic man, I don't absolve him of responsibility of killing somebody. But you have to look past the pictures that we see in the papers, and you have to think, why is this happening? And these youths are the latest in a long line of how governments use and abuse youth in war and politics. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I haven't bored you. I hope that you can have a think about this, and even if I have managed to convince one person who previously believed ISIS is real and who previously believed that Islamic youth are the problem, I hope I might have convinced at least one person to think differently and to look behind the pictures. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time. Have a lovely afternoon. Bye.
This is Hadrian Radio, coming to you from Free Catalonia, a KA radio production.
Good afternoon, Scotland. This is David Raventos, and this is Chapter 10 in Radio Hadrian, here in KA Radio. I want to thank you for being with us in this program that is to be a refuge of all those who are convinced that the attacks in Barcelona, like most attacks that happen in the rest of the world for the last years or decades, is a false flag attack. There are a lot of us, because when you open your eyes and when you're not scared of looking at the truth, you can only come up with the fact that we're in front or we're facing a false flag. The fact that 10%, 20%, 30%, 40% of the Catalan population thinks that this is a false flag, and there's not a single political party or media representing us in this opinion, is in itself evidence of two relevant things. First, that it was a false flag attack, because that unanimity, as we saw with Theodore Ash, which says that to lie to us, they need to be unanimous. Well, the fact that they're all together in this, all the Catalan parties, all the Catalan media, is in itself proof that this is a false attack. Remember, we learned from Leo Strauss, that we mentioned here in this program and we'll keep mentioning, that 99.99% of us have to be systematically lied to. So if you don't belong to the rich white Christian in Western countries who organized the attack, or the people who run the vans, or some of the thousands of journalists being paid in mainstream media to cover the truth, then you are like us. If you're not one of them, you're like us, the 99.99% that have to be lied about the attack in Barcelona, like we're being lied about the process to independence in Scotland, in Catalonia, and in so many other things. So please, whenever you find somebody who has doubts about the official story of the attack in Barcelona, channel him through our Facebook page, or look for the chapters of Radio Hadrian in YouTube, and tell them to listen to our program. Today it's a bit complex because we are not coming live. This is Sunday, but the program is being done before, and there's a demonstration in Barcelona Saturday, 18 hours, and it's a demonstration we are not gonna attend, and I'm not gonna attend. And I think that coming from somebody who did a hunger strike and was interned for independence both in Catalonia and Scotland should merit some attention. Because on the other hand, the Spanish king, a king that is the son of the king that was anointed or appointed by the criminal Franco, he is gonna be in that demonstration, and so is gonna be the Spanish government, and so it's gonna be the Catalan government, so it's gonna be, you know, Puigdemont, that we told you here how by a haphazard number of ways he reached presidency, something very staged and very Spanish. Ada Colau, to who we dedicated Chapter 7, the paid activist that lies more than talks, and she's the mayor of Barcelona, and one of the kings of the Bourbons that we already talked here in Chapter 6, and Rajoy, we already told last week, that takes advantage of what happened. They're all going to be in the demonstration. Well, I'm not going to be in the demonstration for a number of reasons. First, none of these people represent me, because I'm Catalan and I want independence for all these people. That represents 300 years of oppression of my people, so that would be reason enough not to be there. Second, but more important, this demonstration is organized by the same people who did the attacks. Because doing an attack, the same way as we commented, rigging the Scottish referendum is just part of a master plan. It doesn't serve nothing if then you don't launch a newspaper, if you don't push everybody to join SNP, if you don't, a system needs to be complete and perfect. So the same people who organize the attacks is the same people who organize the demonstration. And it's the same people who decides that people need to start chanting and saying, we're not scared, not an impó, instead of volem la veritat, volem saber la veritat, we want to know the truth. Nothing is accidental. So we are talking here about people who don't care about murdering people in their own country, and then they, cool as cucumbers, they organize a demonstration and we're gonna go behind them. Well, I have dignity. I'm not gonna be, in 2 weeks time, people are in hundreds of thousands or millions are gonna be marching for the Catalan Republic. There's no way that the same people can be marching with the royals, with the Spanish government 15 days before that. It's either one or the other. And that's why I didn't go yesterday. I hope nothing happened, because I have my doubts about that. As we are talking of a false flag attack, and not all of people listening to us is very acquainted with the term. We already explained last week. But one of the things that is relevant in this case is that the van attack in Ramblas happens in a place where there's lots of cameras, and now more than a week after that we only have one partial view of a camera in a museum that actually doesn't show anything of what the official version has told us that it happened. So this lack of images brings us back to the most famous false flag attack of the 21st century, which happened the 11th of September of 2001 in New York and the Pentagon. Well, the official version says that the plane hit the Pentagon, but we don't have any image showing that. Then 40 meters of plane are supposed to have passed through a hole of merely 5 meters. It is impossible to do the movements that the plane did at that speed in the hands of somebody non-professional. The impact happens in the part where the non-important or not the high-ranking people were working, while Donald Rumsfeld kept working as usual, and it happened to have the effect that it destroyed the documentation of some investigation about the disappearance of billions of dollars that had been announced just the previous day. So, but the same pattern happens here. There's dozens of cameras showing that part of the Pentagon in petrol stations and in other places. All of them were taken by the authorities, and only an image which we are supposed to think that is a plane, but it is not. You don't see a plane. They tell you, here you see a plane, but you don't. So this lack of images in places where they should be, it also happened in Madrid in 11th of March. We don't see images of the person supposedly doing these things, and it all happens in places with lots of cameras. So what seems obvious is that the real images have been taken, and they only provide us with what they want us to see. Another tremendously thing that rings hollow. We have to visualize one of the important things once we become independent, both in Scotland and in Catalonia, is that we will end up seeing reality through partisan glasses, because that incapacitates us for being critical about things being shown to us. When we, for independence, are supposed to believe that things coming from our politicians or media are truth, and people being for the union has the opposite situation, where they believe their side but they don't believe nothing coming from our side. So the system controls both sides. It's controlled opposition, and there's no way independentists can criticize the actions of Catalan police or Catalan politicians, because they get accused of being unionist, and we get threats and all that. And then whatever part of truth that has to be produced, it comes by the other side, which has the magical effect that it's going to be automatically taken as a lie, because it comes from sources not to be trusted. Okay, one of the things we'll gain with independence, apart from having our destiny in our hands, more money, better services, more democracy, less corruption, and we have our culture guaranteed. But another that seems minor but is very important is, first, they won't be able to throw away responsibility. Oh, that's London's fault, that's Madrid's fault. We're gonna start having governments that are accountable for what they do or for what they don't do. But secondly, we'll stop being in this barricade politics where you have to accept incredible things just because they come from your side, and otherwise you're gonna be in no man's land alone. So the official version of the escape route of the guy which is supposed to have done the attack in Ramblas, it beggars belief. I mean, we're talking that we don't have practically images. He leaves it there in the middle of Ramblas. He's supposed to have run through La Boqueria. La Boqueria, for those of you who haven't been in Barcelona, is as busy as you can imagine. It's very difficult to advance in any pace inside there. It's packed with tourists. It's considered one of the best markets in the world. To cross that in a situation where everybody must be looking at the guy coming down, and it's it's very difficult to believe that thousands of people didn't manage to reduce a guy of 1.70 meters. But then he is supposed to have crossed a city like Barcelona, then steal a car, stab a person, then break one police control, injuring a police woman, and escape. And the whole city was blocked. They made the restaurants close. The rumors were that was one terrorist hidden in a restaurant. The city was blocked for hours. People trapped in the entrances of the city. all for a result of nothing and no images. Well, if we were a normal independent country, we would have journalists questioning the official version, which is very, very well. It's as joke as believing the official version of 9/11 or 11 of March or Hypercore or all these Hollywood films that they deliver to us. Another tremendously suspect part of this story is the chapter we will call the Imam of Ripoll. We already said Ripoll is also known as the cradle of Catalonia for a number of reasons. So linking jihadism, terrorism, and Ripoll is what you would expect from any scriptwriter of a film like the one we are living here. This Imam is supposed to have been in prison. That also brings us back to 9/11. Supposedly Mohammed Atta, he was living with a strip dancer with a pink hair, and he took drugs and alcohol, but then in his alter ego, he's supposed to be religious, integrist, and very different from what he actually was. But then here we have this Imam or Ripoll who happened to be in prison from 2010 to 2014, no less than for drug trafficking, which is not something that you would associate very much with a Islam extremist. And the plot thickens because there was an order to throw him away of Spain, but then at the last minute a Spanish judge revoked the order, so he was allowed to stay. Remember that we already talking in 2014, 2015, Catalonia should already be independent had it not been because our politicians decided to, instead of doing a referendum, to do an opinion poll in 2014. So nothing of this would have happened because this attack has been done with the sole intent of avoiding Catalan independence. Had we been independent in 2014, these people wouldn't have died. So then this drug trafficker decides to become an imam, which seems like a peculiar choice if you ask me. And I'm not like Delia, so I know much less about Islam, but one gets the idea that becoming an imam should have some procedures that are difficult to think that a drug dealer would be easy to do. So he becomes an imam. Then the official story says that he went to Belgium and Vilaweb, which every last person knows in relationship with supposedly integrism. So it's this kind of words that they link. This mythology, this construction of myths requires like these words. Everybody knows. Everybody now knows. Every person and his dog knows Vilaweb and this thing. So it's very important to make these things appear. Well, he went to Belgium to recruit jihadists, it seems, but he didn't succeed. And then Belgian police contacted the police in Catalonia, depending on the version, one source of police or another. But it seems it was in an informal way. And then we are in Alcanar the day before the attack in Barcelona. There's this explosion, like around 9 at night. And after the explosion, that leaves the body of the imam dead, plane tickets for him to Morocco, a letter of warrior of the Islamic State in Arab, like kind of recognizing the action, 100 bottles of gas that were supposed to be used for an attack, and one injured, let's say, accomplice. Well, and with all those things, the attack in Barcelona, like 18 hours after that, or 20 hours after that, with somebody that had criminal activity recorded, and with all that, and it still happened. And on top of that, later, when the 4 detainees, or more like the 4 infiltrated people in this operation, it's incredible because one of them says that this imam wanted to commit suicide, but then another one confesses to have bought plane tickets for the imam. So I don't know if it was to bring the ashes or something, but I find it's a tad contradictory that somebody who plans to kill himself in a bomb attack would buy plane tickets, wouldn't you? So then we go to the next thing, and as this, the more you know about false flag, or the more you know about conspiracies, because we have explained here that conspiracies exist, the more you realize how they are pulling our leg to all of us, because we said before, if you are not with the ones that planned, executed, and covered this attack, then you're being lied to. The other relevant thing is the death of every suspect in this. That, apart from the opinion one might have about death penalty, we're talking about here that there's no, in Spanish state, to which still nowadays Catalonia belongs, there's no death penalty. So we're having policemen here that are applying penalties that no Spanish judge could apply. So that has moral issues. But on top of that, we don't know if these people did it. But the most important thing is, for all of us who knows that we are here in what Civil Edmonds has described as Gladio B, which would be the continuation or the perfection or the variation of Gladio, that was this operation that NATO staged as a stay-behind network in 15 European countries, and now they changed communism, and now the new ghost is Islam. So now that's the excuse they use to terrorize us everywhere. They terrorize us everywhere, and that would be enough to make Ramblas a target to terrorize the world. But on top of that, if you scare people from independence, that's two birds with one stone. But the thing of the amount of death of suspects, that makes it impossible to find who the real organizers are. So that's why it's surprised that none of the supposed suspects have been got alive, and that, apart from being a very probability of having been ordered by somebody, but that brings us back, and now as we're being blamed by most of being conspiracy theories. Later we'll talk about Vicent Pardal and Vilaweb, and we hope it's the last time we talk about this, let's call it newspaper digital, because what we have to say will change things. So anyways, it brings us back to JFK, where Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby, so we could never have a chance to know if he was or not. So all the things here are tremendously weird. But I want to talk of one specific thing, and then want to talk about what Vilaweb has done. There's some things that reek and also bring us back. We also always have to compare with previous false flag. Here we have something called Junta de Seguretat, which is supposed to reunite the different policies organized in the state, that haven't been reunited since 2009. And finally, among a lot of critics between both sides, that Junta de Seguretat, this security committee, got together in July, and with lots of critics, whatever. Remember, we humans, we seem to have short-term memory. So the crimes in Ramblas were already organized by the powers that be. So it was important that the Junta de Seguretat reunited after 8 years, just 1 month before this happened. And this brings us back to the attacks in Madrid in 2004, because they had a drill to avoid terror attacks from the 6th to the 10th of March, and then the very next day it happens. And there were also drills happening in London and other cities while the attacks happened. And that brings us to the conclusion that these security meetings are not to prevent terror attacks. They are to organize them. Then another important factor is we have a Major, Senyor Trapero, from the Mossos d'Esquadra, the Catalan police, which is the police we Catalans love and respect, but that have been caught, and the individual Mossos d'Esquadra need to be loved, but there's some high powers higher on this, which rents the individual policeman. It's the same way as the individual voters, the individual everything. Individual policemen belong to the 99.99%. There's a bunch of people who have organized this, and the police are just there to work, to risk their lives, but not to decide things. Well, There was the highest place, which is the Major, has been empty for 10 years. 10 years this position has not been needed. And then in April, Trapero gets appointed, good friend of the president, against the opinion of syndicates, and bang, only 4 months later, these things happen. How convenient, because he's the person who is doing all the explanations and everything. And to finish, the Minister of Interior has been changed just 1 month ago. So it's too many coincidences, too many. If you pick up this Barcelona attack, it's like the Frankenstein of all the false flag before. Lack of images like in the Pentagon, death of suspects, of all suspects like the GFK, incredible stories like in others. They have links to 11th of March, and things happening just after security gets together, like in Madrid. So as I say, it's the Frankenstein of all the other false flag attacks. And now to finish, I want to talk about Vilaweb and its director Vicent Partal, who's been so low as to do an article ridiculing the people who we know it's a false flag attack, and calling us conspirationists and mocking us and asking for impossible proof, and technically doing everything that a disinformation agent would do. So I don't have time to go into this, but Vicent Partal, by providing an explanation, probably after hearing the program we did last week, has proven that he works with them, because nothing would be accomplished by some people in their rooms organizing this, some disenfranchised people running some bands, if there were not thousands of people like Vicent Partal, in the Catalan version, we'll go deep into him, that are gonna cover it, attacking the people who wants to tell the truth. We're gonna keep saying the truth till they shut us up. In the way we're dealing very, very dangerous people that runs everything in our societies. But it doesn't matter to us, because there's nothing more important than freedom, and we know the truth. For freedom, truth, independence of both our countries, we're gonna go the whole length. Guanyarem.
This is Hadrian Radio, coming to you from Free Catalonia, a KA radio production.